Welcome to Caesarea, in the coastal plain of the land of Israel, the Holy Land. Following our lectures about the Crusaders in the Holy Land, I'm going to take you today on a tour in the footsteps of the Crusaders in the coastal plain, and we're going to visit two important coastal plain cities in the Crusader period. One of them is here, Caesarea. The other one is a less-known place called Arsuf, or Apollonia. So we're starting here at Caesarea, and of course, before we go into the Crusader story, let us say something about the history of this ancient city. Caesarea is an ancient city going back to the 3rd century BC. That is, it is a Phoenician city, not an Israelite, not a Judahite city, in the Hellenistic era. Back then, there was a little city here with a little tiny harbor that I'm going to show you later. A couple of hundreds of years later, in the 1st century BC, in the time of King Herod, Caesarea becomes the great city as it was known in antiquity. A city with a harbor built by King Herod, which was the 3rd biggest harbor in the Roman Empire and the biggest artificial harbor in the Roman Empire. It was built by Herod as part of the city, next to the city, and the city itself was mainly a pagan city, not a Judahite Israelite city. It was built for pagans, and therefore it had shrines, temples, pagan temples in it, and it had vast streets, colonnade streets, and a theater where we're sitting right now, a hippodrome for horse racing, and so on and so forth. That city was not the capital of the land of Israel at the time of King Herod. His capital was in Jerusalem. But after the death of King Herod, when the Romans begin to control the country directly with a series of Roman governors, amongst them, of course, the famous Pontius Pilate, at that time in the 1st century AD, Caesarea becomes for the first time the Roman capital of the district of Judea. So that's a little bit after the time of King Herod, but it will continue to be the capital of this region until the Islamic occupation in the 7th century. In the 1st century AD, we also hear about famous people living or coming to Caesarea. One of them, of course, is, as I mentioned, Pontius Pilate, whose palace was not far from us. Another one is Saint Paul. Saint Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea by the Romans, not far from here, and later he was sent to Rome by the Roman governor to be tried by the emperor, who eventually executed St. Paul in Rome. So part of the story of St. Paul has to do with Caesarea. After the Second Temple period, when the temple was destroyed in the year 70 and most of the Holy Land was destroyed by the Romans during the great revolt of the Jews against the Romans, after that period, Caesarea still remains the capital of the Roman regime in this country for the next couple of hundreds of years. And when Christianity rises, of course, some of the main figures in the history of Christianity also relate to Caesarea. One of them is Origen. Another one is Eusebius, who was the first bishop of Caesarea. And there were others too. Some martyrs lived in Caesarea, such as Procopius, the first martyr of Caesarea, and others too. So Caesarea is definitely an important city in the history of Christianity. By the 7th century, everything changes. Then the Muslims occupy the Holy Land. They take over Caesarea, and Caesarea loses its central position. It is no longer a capital of the central region of the country. Instead, the capital of this region moves to a new city built by the Muslims called Ramla. Caesarea remains a fortified city, and I'm going to show you where its walls used to be, because the Crusaders later will reuse these ancient walls of the Muslims. But Caesarea is no longer a capital under the Muslim rule. It had walls, It was a smaller city than the original Herodian and Byzantine city, but it also had a fortress in it. And of course, the famous harbor, which was established by the Phoenicians and then rebuilt by King Herod. It's still here, only on a smaller scale. It is a smaller harbor than it used to be in the time of King Herod. And then come the Crusaders. In the year 1101, merely 2 years after the Crusaders have conquered the Holy Land, or at least began to conquer the Holy Land, Caesarea was taken by them, along with other cities in the coastal plain. What was so important for the Crusaders in Caesarea? Why did they come here? There were several considerations that led the Crusaders to the decision to take over Caesarea, as well as other coastal plain cities. Caesarea was already a built city. There was a city here, fortifications, that is, gates, towers, and a wall built by the Muslims, by the Umayyads. There was a harbor, a functioning harbor, which is very important, as you will see in a moment. And there was also a fortress, even though the Crusaders would build their own fortress shortly. That was one reason. The other reason was, quite simply, the fact that the crucial point for the defenses of the Crusader kingdom from the west is the coastal plain cities. If the Crusaders do not hold these cities, the Muslims will. The Muslims may invade the Holy Land from the west because they do have a navy. They can invade the inner country via the sea. So it's crucial for the Crusaders to get hold over these coastal plain posts, and Caesarea is one of the most important posts of the Muslims on the coastal plain, even before the Crusades. And finally, one must understand the Crusaders are secluded. They are surrounded by millions of Muslims. They do not have a direct link to Europe. So the sea is their lifeline. If the Crusaders need reinforcement, if they need whatever merchandise, free trade with Europe, it's all going to be through the sea. Therefore, it's crucial for their existence to have that lifeline held constantly alive throughout the 12th century. I'm standing here on the Acropolis of ancient Caesarea since the time of King Herod the Great. The Acropolis, or the higher part of the city, was actually an artificial structure. It's like an artificial mound built by King Herod on arches, and it carried in the Herodian times the temple dedicated to Augustus and the goddess Roma. That was the 1st century BC. Later, on that site, in the Byzantine period, there was a church here. We have actually found the remains of the church on top of the remains of the ancient pagan temple built by King Herod. And then later, in the Muslim era, we believe that the great mosque of Caesarea under the Muslims must have been somewhere around here. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to identify its remains until now. But we still believe that it's somewhere around here on the Acropolis. It makes sense, but we do not have any clear evidence for that. We just hear about the great mosque from the written sources. When the Crusaders came here, they decided to build their church on top of the same Acropolis, which is really fascinating. For 1,000 years, each generation, each regime, each culture, each religion built its center on top of the same Acropolis. How did the Crusader city look like? Well, it's going to be really helpful if we use the model behind me. This model shows Caesarea in the time of the Byzantines, and we can see how small the Crusader city would be in comparison with the Byzantine city and the Herodian city. So if you look at the model, you can clearly see the harbor at the west. This is the Herodian harbor, which was around 200,000 square meters in size. As I said earlier, it is the biggest artificial harbor in the Roman world. It's a technological masterpiece at the time. We can clearly see where we are now. This is the Acropolis, and we can see the temple dedicated by King Herod to the goddess Roma and to Augustus, who was the emperor at the time. We can clearly see the hippodrome outside the walls of the city. We can clearly see the other structures around, such as the theater, the Odeon, another hippodrome. Basically what we see here is Roman Byzantine Caesarea. The size of the city as we see it here is around, I'd say, 300,000 square meters. It's not very big, but the Byzantine city is even bigger than that. It's about 800,000 square meters. So it's quite a considerably a large city in the Roman and Byzantine eras. The Crusaders city, on the contrary, is very small. It's just 120,000 square meters. In comparison to, as I said earlier, the 800,000 meters in the square meters in the Byzantine era. So if we look at the model, we can actually see the size of the Crusader city in comparison to the size of this ancient classical city. When we look at the Crusader city, there are basically three parts to that city. One part is the harbor, another one is the citadel or the fortress, which is built on one of the arms of the ancient harbor, and the third and most important part, of course, is the city. So the city is quite small. The harbor is also very small in comparison to the original Herodian harbor that we can see in the model. The original harbor had actually three parts: the inner harbor, the middle harbor, and the outer harbor, which was the biggest. Of all these sections, of all these parts in the Crusader period, only the middle harbor remains. It's very easy to imagine. Well, we don't have to imagine, because that's exactly the situation today. Nothing remains of the inner harbor. The outer Herodian harbor is now sunk under the water, and the only part surviving is the middle harbor, just as it was in the Crusader period. But what about the Crusader fortress? I said it was built on the southern arm of the harbor built by King Herod. But where exactly? Can we see any of it? And how was it protected? Let's go and see it. When the Crusaders took over Caesarea, they decided to build a large fortress to protect the city and the harbor from the west. Where would they build it? They decided to take part of the former southern arm of the Herodian water break and basically build on top of that a huge fortress. Actually, you can see it from here. It's the place where this huge building with the Israeli flag on it. If you take a close look at it, you can see that on the left, it's actually the remains of the ruins of the fortress built by the Crusaders. The building that we see today is a 19th century, 20th century building, so it's quite modern. It's a bit irony, I think, a bit of an irony when you look at the flag, the Israeli flag. It was built by the Crusaders, who massacred the Jews when they entered the Holy Land, and today the Crusader fortress is used by the Israeli state, and the Israeli flag is proudly crowning the top of the citadel. Nevertheless, the Crusaders' fortress was protected very well from three sides, from north, south, and the west, by the Mediterranean Sea. However, it was linked directly to the city on the east. And that was a problem. They wanted to have a fully protected citadel, meaning they had to have a moat, a deep trench, to separate the Crusader fortress from the Crusader city. And the way they did it was quite simple. As you recall, they built their fortress on the southern arm of the Herodian breakwater. So they simply dismantled part of the breakwater and created an artificial tunnel into which the sea water probably were streamed. That's exactly what you see behind me. You can see the trench defending the fortress from the city, separating it, and of course a Crusader wall immediately behind it. It's actually the western boundary of the Crusaders' new trench, the Crusaders' new moat. The Crusaders in the Holy Land always built walls around their cities to protect them from a possible Muslim attack. Caesarea was no exception, and it was surrounded by a massive wall that I'm going to show you shortly. Of course, once you have a wall, you need to leave some spaces, gates, to allow people in and out. And indeed, in Caesarea, we have found 3 gates, one in the south, one in the north, and the best preserved one is right behind my back. It is the Crusader Eastern Gate of Caesarea. Mind you, the top of the gatehouse here is reconstructed. It was reconstructed by the Israeli archaeologists who did the work here, but it still remains a typical Crusader gate because basically they used the fallen stones that were found here for the restoration. So basically it is an authentic Crusader gate. Take a look at its shape. It has the typical pointed arch at the top. It has a tower on the left-hand side, and it is very massive. Let me take you inside the gate and we'll take a look at some of its architectural components. Follow me. I'm now inside the gate of Caesarea, the Eastern Gate of Caesarea. Or actually, I should be more accurate, it's the gatehouse. What's the difference, you may ask? Well, allow me to explain. You see, a gate is basically an opening, a doorway. If you build a gate in a wall, you create a weak point in the defenses. A wall stops the enemy, an opening allows the enemy in. So one has to design some way of protecting that opening, and the Crusaders did it in 2 different ways. And you can see that right here. You see, the first thing is to incorporate the gate, the opening, into a large fortification, a large building that we call a gatehouse. So I'm inside the gatehouse of Caesarea. To my right, you can see the inner gate, meaning the inner opening, and to my left, you can see the outer opening. They are both embedded into that large structure, which fortifies the openings. Now, that's one method. The other way to protect the gates of Caesarea is by an indirect access. What does it mean? Well, to my right, you can see the inner gate, and to my left you can see the outer gate, and they are not arranged along one axis. Actually, in order to get out of Caesarea or into Caesarea, one has to go into the gatehouse and then turn to the right or to the left, depending on the direction of access. In this way, one breaks the momentum of the attack of enemy soldiers or horses trying to break into the gate. So, creating an indirect access, having a fortification that we call a gatehouse, both actually solve the problem of the weak point in the walls of Caesarea. Now let's take a look at 2 interesting architectural features, Crusader architectural features, we can actually see in this gate. Take a look at the roof above my head. This is the reconstructed roof of the gatehouse, and you can clearly see it's not straight, it is actually vaulted. It's like an arch, but above that you can see clearly the arches that support it. These arches are called ribs, just like in a rib cage in our body. And these ribs are typical of the Gothic style in Europe. So actually what we see here is a transitional phase in the architecture of the Crusaders. We see here the introduction of the Gothic style into the previous style, which is the Romanesque style, in which the Crusaders built other buildings in the country before the introduction of the Gothic style. So we know that this gate was built by the Crusaders. But can we be more specific? Do we know the name of the builders? Actually, we do. If you'd like to know that, come with me. Let me take you to the moat to see the might and the beauty of the walls built here in the 13th century. Now, for the first time, we can actually see the robust and impressive walls of Caesarea, and we can also see the moat outside the walls. Now, the Crusaders, like in many other places, when they build a wall, it's insufficient for them. They also add a trench or a ditch or a moat outside, so that when the enemy's soldiers approach the walls, this would be another barrier, and in order to get to the wall they have first to go down into the moat, and of course they expose themselves to the arrows of the defenders. So the question is, who built these walls? Fortunately, we have written sources from the times of the Crusades and later periods, and they tell us that the builder of the walls of Caesarea was actually a king, a French king, and his name is King Louis IX. King Louis IX led 2 crusades to the Holy Land, the 7th Crusade in the middle of the 13th century and the 8th Crusade. Actually, in the 8th Crusade, he died on the way to the Holy Land, so he never made it. The 7th Crusade was a total failure. He failed to defeat the Egyptian army, the Muslims in Egypt, and he actually was, his army was destroyed. Many of his soldiers were captured by the Muslims, and he himself was a captive of the Muslims until he was ransomed. And when he was ransomed, when he was released, Louis IX made his way from Egypt to this land, to the Holy Land. And he visited several places. And he spent 3 years here, from 1251 to 1254. He spent here a couple of years, in which he built fortifications in the Holy Land. He fortified Jaffa, he fortified Akko, where we're going to be in another tour, and he also fortified the city of Caesarea. The walls that we see here are from the time of Louis IX. And there's a story even about him taking part in building these walls, carrying buckets of stones to build the wall of Caesarea. So these walls are definitely from the time of Louis IX, but if this is the case, then there's a question about these walls. Louis IX also built walls in France. And the way he builds walls is a bit different than what we see here. The walls that Louis IX builds in France are walls with round towers. Here, the towers are rectangular, as you can see for yourselves. For many years, scholars were puzzled by the fact that these towers are not round, until, in a recent excavation that was conducted inside the towers, something was discovered. As it happened, the walls built by King Louis IX were actually a rebuild of more ancient walls from the early Islamic period. And the original walls, the Muslim walls, had rectangular towers, and therefore King Louis IX towers were also rectangular. These walls were attacked in 1265 by the Mamelukes, led by the great leader, the Sultan Baybars. The conquest of Caesarea by Baybars was quite quick and swift. His army attacked in the early hours of the morning, when the Crusaders least expected an attack. His soldiers got down into the moat. They improvised ladders from the reins of their horses and so on and so forth, and basically climbed up, surprising the Crusaders on the walls and breaking into the city. The Crusaders inside the city fled into the fortress. That was the inner fortification where we've been earlier on this tour. But after a week of siege, they decided that they should surrender, and they left Caesarea unharmed. That was the end of Caesarea as a capital city, but it was also the end of Caesarea as a settlement. Immediately behind me, you can clearly see the remains of the Crusader wall. But if you look at the top of the wall, you can clearly see that it was actually destroyed. Intentionally, someone took down the stones and created this gap between the two sections of the walls remaining. That was Baibars' deed. Baibars systematically destroyed the walls of Crusader Caesarea. As a result, Caesarea ceased to exist as a settlement. A small fisherman's village, well, existed here from time to time, but the glorious city of King Herod, of the Byzantines, of the early Muslims, of the Crusaders, is no longer here. Caesarea ceased to exist as a thriving settlement after the conquest of Baibars. It remained a small, poor fisherman's village. From time to time, people settled here. In the 19th century, Bosnian Muslims were settled here by the Turkish government, and eventually the lands of Caesarea and its surroundings were bought by Baron Rothschild, the patron of the Zionist movement, who bought these lands, and later a settlement was built here, the modern settlement of Jewish Caesarea. In the 20th century, the excavations began in Caesarea, excavations that continue till this day. Baibars' destruction apparently is not unique. We see the same thing, same picture of destruction all over the coastal plain. So the question is, why did Baibars decide to destroy the cities and the fortifications of the coastal plain of the land of Israel? To answer that question, we should go now to Arsuf, Apollonia, another coastal plain city built by the Crusaders.